Welcome to City Life. I'm Beverly Thompson. Joining me to talk about the city's response to this disaster, as well as procedures and precautions that are taken to prevent these types of events, are Deputy City Manager Bo Ferguson and Fire Chief Robert Zoldos. Welcome, and thank you both for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So, Chief, let's start with you.
Sure.
Okay. You've been in the Durham Fire Department since November. Very short time. So what has been your impression of the fire department so far?
Well, the fire department's been great. They've welcomed me with open arms, and they've been very accepting to some of the new procedures and policies that I'm bringing forth to them. I've really enjoyed working with them. They're well-trained, they're very aggressive, and they're a great fire department to be part of.
That's great. Great to hear. I know Bo appreciates that as their boss. So, a little bit about your history. I know you were one of the first responders at 9/11, and in fact at the Pentagon, actually. Did this scene remind you of that at all? And how did that change your approach to what you needed to do?
Sure. I was a member of the Ferguson County Urban Search and Rescue Team, and I was deployed 11 times to disasters all over the world. One of those was the Pentagon on 9/11, and the building collapse actually reminded me of that in a very small scale, in that it had a pancake-style collapse, which is multiple floors straight down, and then there was a cantilever collapse to the left-hand side. The Pentagon was to the right-hand side, but it was similar, and the devastation was similar again on a very small scale, and it required us to do very similar things: attack the fire, deal with the collapse, as well as people that could possibly be trapped.
What were some of the first thoughts that went through your mind after you arrived?
Well, on previous missions for the Urban Search and Rescue Team, we have hours, sometimes days, before we get to the actual work site. Here, I was coming from City Hall, and so I had all of 3 to 4 minutes to really start drawing, on that experience. And this is my adopted town now, and it was shocking to see that sort of disaster right downtown, so close to us. But once we get there, everyone goes back to their training, and they start engaging on the scene, and the firefighters, the officers, everyone really did a nice job there.
So, Bo, as a city leader, what were some of the first thoughts that went through your mind in terms of how to respond to this?
So I was sitting in my office in a meeting when we heard the explosion, and of course it was close enough to City Hall that it was extremely loud and shook the windows in City Hall. And so, we're in a downtown environment. We hear loud noises all the time, but it just struck me, that there was something really different about what had just happened. And so I was scared. I think, like a lot of people who hear a noise like that and wonder what the impacts were, but immediately started trying to find out what had happened, and before long had started to get stories trickling in that there had been an explosion. Was able to connect with the chief, and very lucky that he was here at City Hall, and so we were able to head over to the scene together. And I guess upon arriving, there's two frames of thinking that sort of take over. One is the professional side, right? And what do we need to do, and what are they going to be doing? And obviously in a situation like that, they're trained to rush in and get it done. And so on that part, I felt very confident that despite what we were looking at, that we had the right resources in place to deal with it. And then the other frame of mind is just what you're seeing, and it's so unlike what you experience on a day-to-day basis. There were people who were injured. There was a great deal of destruction. There was an active fire. There were emergency services professionals coming in from every direction, and it's emotional, and it's still emotional to think about. So I was immediately, my responses were both confidence that we would get our arms around this thing and deal with it appropriately, but also fear and anxiety for what you're seeing in front of your eyes.
Yeah. So what did you guys talk about on the way over? Did you kind of lay out a game plan of how you'd approach this, or you were just thinking?
To be honest, I was listening to the radio, and we were trying to put together what the scene was really, what the scene really entailed. There's a lot of radio traffic, but it really didn't draw a great picture for us in those early times, because we also had several firefighters injured. And so, that doesn't derail what we do, but it adds another element to emergency response.
And the truth is, it was such a short ride. Just mere minutes from City Hall to Duke Street where this tragedy happened, and so I barely remember it. I certainly remember getting out of the car and heading to that intersection, but I'm sure we exchanged some information, but right now I couldn't begin to remember what it was.
I mean, of course, you don't run into or have incidents like this every day, so thank God. But, I remember a lot of people wanted to know how in the world could this happen? How could a company get access to a permit to the Durham, to the right-of-way that would enable something like this to happen? So talk to me a little bit about what the process is to even get a right-of-way permit.
Sure. The reality is that work like this is happening around the city every day in dozens of locations. There are hundreds of active permits in the case of a year. Durham is a thriving, vibrant city where a lot of commerce is getting done, and as a result of that, there's a lot of people installing infrastructure in the right-of-way, making upgrades to the systems that they have. So the answer to how these circumstances came about is it's a really commonplace procedure, and I think we'll talk in a little bit maybe about how what might have gone wrong here, but we have a process that any company that wants to do work in the right-of-way, the first thing they have to do is get a license agreement. We control that right-of-way. Sometimes it's ours, sometimes it's the state's, and in this case it was the state's, but the city grants permission for you to do work in that right-of-way. The first thing you have to do is get that license, and that's actually something that the city council grants to individual companies. That license has a lot of requirements that I won't bore you with, but there's bonding requirements and insurance. There's lots of regulations that we reference to make sure that people know that when they do work in the right-of-way, there's a lot of rules they have to follow. Once you have that license agreement, you also then have to apply for and get a permit. And that permit is kind of geographic specific. It says where you're going to be working in. It's a dialogue between the company and our staff showing exactly what types of utilities are going in and where they're going to be. And so that permit has to be approved before anyone has a right to get started working. Before they start working, they need to call 811. That is a critical step for anyone digging in the right-of-way. And that is a statewide clearinghouse that lets utility companies know that someone wants to be doing work. They send out that notice to those utilities, and all those utilities have a requirement within a certain number of days to go out and mark their infrastructure so that the company that's going out to do the digging knows what to expect. And then finally, within the permit and that license agreement, as well as city law, state law, and federal law, there are requirements of that contractor about how they are supposed to commence that work, how they are supposed to find and locate other utilities. And it's that combination of permit and license agreement and all those laws that protect the public. So following all those things, accidents rarely, if ever, occur. And the tragedy here is we hit that one instance where something went wrong, and we don't know the answer to what that is yet, but clearly we're anxious to find out.
Still under investigation, huh?
Yes.
Yeah. So about, you mentioned all that, the permitting and licensing. What kind of oversight does the city have, in fact?
Sure. So the primary oversight we provide is to make sure that you're following our permit appropriately. Our permit process is designed to make sure that you put your new utility in the right-of-way, your fiber line, your new gas or water line, in a place where it's not going to conflict or run into other people's utilities. And that's in part because if you ever have to do maintenance in the future, you're going to have to dig it up. We don't want you so close to everything else that you're going to create a lot of problems. Our permit review and our inspections are primarily to make sure you put things where you said you were going to put them, and that you followed those guidelines, and that when you were done, you put everything back the way you found it. Because obviously a lot of this right-of-way is in people's front yards. It's in the public right-of-way where we have sidewalks and other critical infrastructure. So it's really important to make sure that contractors who dig up a sidewalk or who dig up someone's front yard go back and put it back the right way. That's the city's core responsibility under state law. Obviously, there are questions about safety, and we can handle that, I think, in a future question. But our primary responsibility is to make sure you put it in the right place and to make sure you put it back the way you found it.
So let's talk a little bit about this incident specifically, and I know it's still under investigation. But when a gas leak is reported, what are the guidelines that you have to follow to respond?
Sure. There's a whole set of them. It's about 11 pages, but I can try to get it down into sort of the Cliff Notes version, if you will. The first is, upon arrival, we expect the first arriving unit to establish command, isolate the area, and deny entry. And what that means is once we get there and we know that there is an issue there, a hazmat of some sort, hazardous materials of some sort, we're going to make sure no one else gets into that area as soon as we identify it. The second, we're going to work to identify that hazard. Now here it's easy because it was a gas leak. That's one of our easier ones, but any hazmat, sometimes it'll take us a while to identify what the actual chemical might be. We'll move on to requesting additional resources, which on this particular scene, obviously we did, because it got a very large response at the end. We'll establish and maintain control zones, and those typically go in hot, warm, and cold. Hot is the area we want very highly specialized trained firefighters in. The warm is where maybe some of the command officers and the decontamination lane will be, and then the cold will be everybody else. From then we'll move into really our tactical priorities. The first of which is we want to make sure our responders aren't getting into additional risk so they become victims themselves. Next, we worry on rescuing the victims that are already there. Third, we move into evacuation or sheltering in place as necessary. And I touched on that, in-place protection. Many times at hazardous materials emergencies, the scene is too big to move everyone out of it. So what we'll do is what we call shelter in place, in-place protection. Often people are better protected where they're at. In fact, even in high-rise fires, for example, there's a lot of floors we're not even going to evacuate because it's just not necessary to do so. We'll move on to instant stabilization control techniques, whether it is shutting off gas, putting out a fire, controlling a hazmat, diking it so it can't get away, those sort of things will be the next step. Then we move into property protection, and then finally environmental protection. And there's a lot to it. The full document is available at durhamnc.gov, and so anyone can take a look at it. But there's a lot of steps for the fire department to handle once they get there, working with our other partners like the gas company and so forth to mitigate this stuff.
So some of these steps happen immediately, others could happen over a few hours, huh?
Absolutely. The initial steps, the isolating the area, denying entry, establish command is immediate. We're going to do that as soon as we have the resources on scene to do it. Protecting the environment and property could take days, weeks, months, years, depending on how big of a hazmat it is.
So who is actually responsible for identifying the gas leak and shutting down the service?
It depends on the scope. For a small appliance that has a gas leak where a homeowner calls, we can show up and we'll detect that there's gas in there using meters, and we'll say, okay, it's here, we'll shut it off at the appliance, and then it's up to the homeowner to get repair company to come in and fix it, and then they'll relight the pilots or so forth. On large incidents like this, the gas company's going to be responsible because we had to shut it down at a main. That takes a while to do. Plus, they're pressurized systems. It takes a long time for that pressure to get down where it's a safe level. So those will all be done under the authority of the gas company.
Okay. So, Bo, let's talk about this case specifically. Who is actually conducting the investigation for this incident?
Sure. So there's a state agency called the North Carolina Utilities Commission, and they have oversight and responsibility for the laws in the state of North Carolina that govern safe digging, and they also have investigative authority over incidences like the one that happened here in Durham. So they have inspectors who are on the scene almost immediately once this explosion happened and stayed on the scene for a number of days. They then coordinated with the gas company to do an excavation of the line that happened in early May, and the results of what they found when they got down to the gas line are something that they're examining now. They'll publish a report that goes to the clerk of the North Carolina Utilities Commission. That should have all the information that really answers the question about what happened wrong here.
And what about the fire department? What does the fire department do in terms of investigation?
Well, the fire marshal's office, which is part of the fire department, is tasked with determining the reason for the fire itself.
Okay. All right.
It's a simpler investigation comparatively. We're going to be looking for cause and origin of the fire. So we're going to investigate why did that fire start, what fueled it, and so forth. And our investigation is ongoing as well because it is such a large scene. There's so many witnesses. It's just going to take a little while to do.
And how do you use that information? Well, besides giving it to the media after they ask for it.
Sure. The information really can go into, in an arson case, it can go to prosecution. We'll work with the police department to actually, write up and serve warrants and prosecute a case and so forth. In this particular one, it will be worked working with conjunction with our state and federal partners to help us prevent this type of issue in the future.
I know in this case there was an evacuation done, of course.
Sure.
What happens when there is a larger scale evacuation? Do you use the Alert Durham system?
Sure. Actually, both systems were used.
They were used for
in this particular scene. The standard is the door-to-door. That's firefighters going door-to-door, knocking on the door, and getting people to leave. This type of evacuation is a judgment call based on the captains and battalion chiefs. They're going to be the incident commander early on in the incident, depending on the severity. There's going to be times where we might evacuate a house on each side of a building that has a problem, or in this case, we might evacuate a city block. It's really a judgment call. Part of that, and I mentioned earlier, is also the judgment to remove people from harm, or is it safer to keep them in place? Again, that's a judgment call to make sure that we either keep people out of harm's way or remove them from the area of harm. In this particular case, keeping people inside their buildings might be a smarter move rather than bringing them in front of where they could be struck by the explosion itself. In these early moments, it's imperative, though, I do want to ask all the viewers, it's imperative that civilians heed those orders immediately because as we're going door to door, we're trying to move as fast as we can, but in those early moments, there's always limited resources because fire trucks are still responding, but those first companies are going to be doing that. In fact, according to North Carolina code, it's actually illegal to disobey those commands, and by the fire chief or their designees. So when we knock at the door and say, "Hey, you need to get out," we want people to do it quickly so that we can get them out of harm's way and move on to the next occupancy. The Alert Durham system is actually a really good system, and I want to remind everyone it's free, but you have to sign up for it. And so we would encourage everyone to do that. I'll explain how in a second. It actually was first used at 10:30 and then at 10:39 on April 10th. And both of them really said, hey, there's a gas explosion at this address, stay away from the area. And now that wasn't a major use of it to evacuate, but it did allow us to help people reroute and stay away from the area just to keep them safe. So it was used at 10:30 and 10:39, but it's a free service, but you got to sign up, and the best way to do it is get to alertdurham.com, sign up. You can choose which pieces that you want of it, but it's a great way to not only avoid traffic issues, it'll keep you safe.
So, Chief, are you confident that everything, the systems worked like they were supposed to?
Sure. I mean, we're going to conduct a review of our operations to see what we can do better, but our early, hot wash of what happened shows that our firefighters operated not only within guideline, but operate pretty heroically to get people out of those buildings.
Very much heroes, for sure. So, let's talk about site restoration and cleanup. Who's responsible for that? I know we get a lot of calls asking, what's the city doing? Who's responsible?
All right, so right after the explosion, that the site had a lot of debris. There was debris in Duke Street. We actually, as the fire department was responding and looking for potential victims in the building, we had to move debris into the street. And then also, the surrounding buildings were all significantly damaged by the blast to varying degrees. Primarily, the cleanup of all of that falls to the insurance companies who insured those buildings that were damaged. While the city did some basic cleanup of the right-of-way not long after the accident, blown glass and debris that was in the street, most of the debris really is the property of the property owners, and therefore the insurance companies who insured those buildings took those steps. We expect that process to take some time, and while it's underway now, people need to understand some of these buildings may end up being demolished, other buildings need significant work to be restored, and so all of that work is being done by those private insurance companies.
Do you know if there's any assistance available for these businesses from local or state or even federal agencies?
Sure. I'm proud of the fact that the city, with our partners in emergency management, acted quickly to try and seek assistance for businesses that were impacted by this tragedy. The mayor declared a state of emergency primarily to allow us to seek state assistance, and then we submitted a request to the state of North Carolina that was approved. A disaster declaration was issued, and primarily what that does is it frees up disaster assistance assistance for businesses. So businesses that were impacted, either that couldn't operate after the blast or might have had significant challenges based on people not coming to the area, they are eligible for low interest loans, and those loans can be made for those businesses. We also have a small business advisory committee in the city that takes a more nuanced approach talking to those businesses and trying to understand their needs and try to help them get through this period where the cleanup is underway and maybe access to those businesses is compromised.
Okay, I'm sure we'll show the website that people can use to actually apply for any kind of assistance.
Great.
That'd be great. Chief, let's just talk about the businesses in the area.
Sure.
I mean, Maverick Smokehouse and Tap Room was awesome, weren't they?
Yes, they were.
They actually served as a staging site for you. What can businesses learn from a response like that in case such a need ever arises again?
Well, first I want to start off by thanking all the local businesses for helping us out, Mavericks being the leader among them. There is something about the ability to work at a major disaster site, but remove yourself, even if it's for 10, 15, 20 minutes, away from the noise, the commotion, and the loss of life, to allow our people to recharge, get their batteries back good to go, and then get right back in at full speed. And Mavericks allowed us to do that. So I can't thank them and all the other businesses in the area that really just poured out to us, including the rest of the city too. Everyone's just so helpful to us. But so what can businesses do? Really, the fire department, when we respond to an incident like that, we still have all the basic needs in our life. You know, we still have to eat and still have to rest and so forth. And having a business open the doors to us really just makes it so much easier for us. So knowing that there's businesses in the city, I'm sure all across the city would be happy to do that for us. Is just huge for us. But like I said, it really made us a more effective fire and rescue force because our people had the ability to get a regular meal, not something that was in a box right beforehand, and then get back in the game without having to be driven out or relieved and going back to a station. It really allowed us to be much more effective.
Kudos to Durham businesses.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, I think you may have covered this already, but you talked about the kinds of assistance that are available to Durham businesses that were impacted by the explosion. So,
in addition to that, I think I'd like to offer, for residents who are interested in what they can do, I would encourage them to go to a couple of websites that have information. If folks go to alertdurham.com, that's where primarily information for those businesses can be found. But residents who go to downtowndurham.com, there's information just about the area and the recovery. And then there are a number of fundraisers that were started to help victims and potentially help businesses after the incident. Those can be found at discoverdurham.com. As always, the city can't endorse any of those specifically. We do encourage people to always make sure they're vetting those fundraisers to make sure that the dollars that they're asking for are really going to go to victims of this tragedy. One of the other big things I'd strongly encourage people to do is go back to this area, go back and shop, help this area recover. We have a lot of great homegrown Durham iconic businesses right in this business district, and the explosion, I think, both physically and probably emotionally kind of made this area off limits for some people. It's a tragic thing to see and be near, and of course roads were closed for a really long time. Go back to these businesses. They need the business. We need to get this part of the city back and functioning again, and we need people down there, and that's what makes Durham great. We know that people watching this broadcast and people all over Durham are flocking back to this area, and we need them to make an effort to do so.
and if there are any concerns about parking?
There's ample parking around that area. There's lots of on-street parking, and we also just learned that the Wexford building has a parking deck just south of the tracks there on the other side of Gregson. That is open in the evenings for people and on weekends to come for free shopping, and so for free parking, to do their shopping and to dine at restaurants. So there's always going to be plenty of parking, and get information from downtowndurham.com or the city's website about the availability.
Right, and it's called the Brightleaf District.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. Anything else you'd like to add?
I really just want to touch on just the outpouring from the whole city, which is so impressive. Not only helping out the families of those who were lost, helping out the businesses, helping out the first responders, but just supporting each other. I'm real glad this is my new place to call.
Oh, we're glad to have you here, Chief.
Thanks.
And I want to add my pride in our city staff, pride in our partners in public safety in the county and in the state. It was it was tragic to be on the scene that day, but it was also heartwarming to see the preparedness of the people who came out to respond, the teamwork between different agencies that frequently don't get many opportunities to train together or work together. It was extremely heartening to see that if your community had to go through a tragedy like this, that it had public servants of the quality that we did who prevented more loss of life and really worked quickly to take care of victims and to get us on the road to recovery. So really, really proud of that effort.
All right. Thank you both for joining me. Sure. I really appreciate it. I know how busy you are. Thank you. That does it for City Life. Don't forget to follow us on social media, watch us on Durham Television Network and on YouTube, and listen to our podcast on iTunes. I'm Beverly Thompson. Thank you for joining me to learn more about City Life in Durham.